Hello, this is the first mini lecture for Psych 1010, Intro to Psychology. And in this mini lecture, I'll be discussing the 7 scientific perspectives in psychology. Pretty much every single scientific research study in psychology boils down to one of these two questions. Why do people think the way they do? Or why do people behave the way they do? Psychology is all about being able to describe psychological phenomena, describe how people act and how they think, as well as being able to predict how people will act or think in a given situation. And so in psychology, we often refer to the nature versus nurture paradox, that there's this debate between what has a greater influence on people's behavior. Is it their nature, characteristics that they're born with, or is it their nurture, things that they experience over the course of their lifetimes, things that they learn, things from their environment that influence their behavior? And so there are 7 basic approaches, 7 basic frameworks for approaching questions in psychology that psychologists use to conduct research studies. And I'm going to provide a brief overview of each of these 7 different perspectives and how they are used commonly in psychology. So, first is the biological perspective, and this is all the way on the nurture side of the equation. Researchers who look at psychology from a biological perspective, they're interested in genes, they're interested in brain chemistry, they're interested in studying how different areas of the brain might work together and how those brain areas might differ or how brain function differs between individuals with various characteristics. They might use neuroimaging to see how different areas of the brain connect together or how people's brains are wired differently. And so when they're asking the question, why do people behave the way they do? They would say, well, maybe it's their biological makeup. Then there's evolutionary psychologists. From an evolutionary perspective, when they ask the question, why do people behave the way they do? They might say that, well, maybe it's has something to do with how human brains have evolved over time. Maybe it has to do with how certain genes have been favored over time, or how certain genes have allowed individuals to adapt better to their environment. So, for example, if we were to ask the question, why are some people very altruistic and very giving to others and other people aren't? We might say, an evolutionary psychologist might say that, well, perhaps the genes that give rise to the brain regions that allow people to be more altruistic were favored over time or were passed down over time by natural selection because it was more advantageous for certain environments. So that would be the evolutionary perspective of psychology. Then there's the cognitive perspective, a very popular form of investigation within psychology. And in the cognitive perspective, the brain and the mind is often compared to a computer. The software of a computer. So, in the biological perspective, the brain is kind of viewed as the hardware of a computer. It's like the physical keyboard or the actual screen itself. Whereas in cognitive psychology looks at the software, the actual processes that are going on underneath that you can't see, your memory, your thinking abilities, intelligence, language, emotion, motivation, cognitive biases, all these inner mental processes that aren't visible to the eye. And so when cognitive psychologists ask the question, why do certain people behave the way they do? Cognitive psychologists would say, maybe it's because people think differently. Maybe it's differences in people's mental processes that we can study and understand to explain human behavior. Next, there's the humanistic perspective. The humanism is really the central essential tenet of humanism is the belief that all humans have an innate potential for good. And so, within the field of psychology, we evaluate the question: how do we help people reach their potential? How do we help people reach that high level of innate goodness? And so, when a humanist psychologist asks the question, "Why do people behave the way they do?" They might say that, well, it's maybe people's behavior gives us a sign about their ultimate goals in life or what they find naturally fulfilling in life. And so the humanistic perspective is right in the middle of the spectrum, right between nature, that there's certain goals or certain aspects of life that are naturally fulfilling, and there's certain goals and aspects of life that people want to achieve based off their environment, based off what society says is important. Then there's the psychodynamic perspective, which is largely based on the works of Sigmund Freud. Um, and in the psychodynamic perspective, there's an emphasis on the role of the unconscious mind, childhood experiences, interpersonal relationships. And so, in contrast to the cognitive perspective, the psychodynamic perspective says, well, maybe it's not just the abilities that people are consciously aware of, like memory or language use, that shape behavior. Maybe it's things that are unconscious, that are more difficult, or that are deeper in our psyche, that really dictate how people behave and allow us to predict how people will behave. And then there's the behavioral perspective, which is all focused quite the opposite of the psychodynamic or the cognitive perspective, which is really focused on visible behaviors. Maybe when answering the question, why do people behave the way they do? A behaviorist would say that, well, it has to do with things that are learned and reinforced over the lifespan, things that are conditioned, or things that are punished, or things that are rewarded, that they learn to associate over their lifespan. And this school of thought was very popular throughout the 20th century, but began to lose its hold as technology allowed us to better study the mind in new and amazing ways. And lastly, there's a social cultural perspective, which covers everything that isn't covered in the previous six. And that has to do with maybe people behave the way they do because of societal norms, because of what society expects, how people should behave in a particular social situation. Maybe people behave the way they do because of race and ethnicity. Maybe it has to do with gender and sexuality. And so there's all kinds of different areas or aspects of society that can have an influence on behavior. So most psychologists use a variety of these approaches to do their work. It's not common for a psychologist to stick just in one area. It does happen in some fields, but most psychologists use a variety of these approaches to evaluate research questions.